Hi, this is Dan Lynch. Join Jonathan Bennett and I for FLOSS Weekly, where we'll be talking to Gareth McCumskey about the serverless framework. Serverless aims to take all the hassle out of managing infrastructure and server stuff away from developers so they can get on with what they do best, writing code. It's a really hot thing right now. You're going to want to find out more, so stick around because it's coming up next.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is FLOSS Weekly, episode 540, recorded Wednesday, July 31st, 2019. Serverless. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by NetScout. Meeting the digital demands of today starts with a bold, new IT strategy. NetScout is delivering a new perspective, visibility without borders, to guide your digital success and data center transformation. Get seamless visibility and monitoring for performance and security. See how at netscout.com. Hello and welcome to another episode of FLOSS Weekly, the show about free, libre, open source software. I'm your host for this week. My name is Dan Lynch. And of course, I'm not Randall Schwartz. Once again, Randall, unfortunately, is not here, but we'd like to stress that he's doing very well and he's in 100% health and all the rest of it. But unfortunately, his internet connection is not at 100% health this week. And that's why I've been drafted in again. So just when you thought it was safe, when you thought you were getting a week off from your strange British substitute teacher, I've come back again, and who knows? I'm always around. I'm lurking. I'm ready to pop up. So I'm back, but I'm not here on my own. Thankfully, I'm here with Jonathan Bennett. Jonathan, how are you doing?
I am good. It seems like I am the normal the normal stand-in co-host when Randall's not here. Normal stand-in co-host all the time, I think.
Yeah. I mean, we're kind of like, we should come up with a name for ourselves. We're kind of like the subs or the substitutes or I don't know, the B team. I don't know how we, we're not the A team. We'd be the B team, maybe. I don't know. But yeah. So I'm once again in my, people on the stream will be able to see, I'm once again in my my little studio here at home in Liverpool in the UK. Jonathan, where are you speaking to us from?
Still here in the corporate headquarters, as we call it, the home office here in Lawton, Oklahoma.
Excellent. And it's been a while since we've chatted, actually. It's nice to be back on the same show. I think it must be months. It must be a few months now.
Oh, it's been quite a while, yeah. Because we have to have a couple of things happen. We have to have me be up as a co-host and Randall out for some reason, and you to be up as a host for us to be together. But I always enjoy it when we get to interact and do a show together.
Excellent. Me too. So today's guest project is Serverless, the serverless framework. I've been having a little bit of a look at this, but I know it's a big movement right now. There's a lot of excitement around the whole serverless movement in development, web development, and so on. Have you had any experience of it, Jonathan?
I've had about 5 minutes to look at their website this morning.
Okay.
It looks like, just for their elevator pitch appears to be, there's all these different hosting companies, like Google has all of their Google Drive and the rest of their hosting platform. Amazon, of course, has the entire Amazon cloud. Microsoft has Azure and all of that. And they're not necessarily always very interoperable, and there's little different quirks for building applications on each of these different platforms. And it looks to me that serverless is just kind of this, let's make all of that equal. Let's give you a base API. We'll take care of all of the magic to make it run the same everywhere. And then you just write against serverless, and then your application becomes agnostic as to which of these cloud platforms it runs on. That's, in the 5 minutes I've looked, that's what it seems to be about. We'll see if I'm right.
That sounds, we'll find out in a minute from our guest, but that to me sounded like a brilliant summation of it. I'm glad you did that because you've encapsulated that beautifully. So we're going to find out more about that in just a minute. But before we do that, I need to thank our sponsor for today before we bring the guest on. So this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by NetScout. Accelerating innovation and operational agility that can meet the demands of today's digital world starts with a bold, new IT strategy. As the pace of change continues to exponentially increase, so too does the risk of failure, raising the stakes for CIOs, architects, and IT operations. Simply put, digital transformation has changed the game, but NetScout has a different perspective, one that was built for the era of digital and data center transformation. It's called Visibility Without Borders. This real-time visibility extends to wherever your technology infrastructure and business applications reside. As the world leader in transforming packet data, NetScout's smart data delivers high-resolution and continuous monitoring across any network, data center, cloud, 5G, and more. Already in use monitoring and securing some of the world's most critical commercial and public service infrastructures, NetScout's next-generation level of visibility provides the holistic perspective that IT teams are seeking. See more at netscout.com. That's NETSCOUT.com. And we thank NetScout for their support of FLOSS Weekly. And with that, we should go ahead and bring on our guest, Gareth McCumskey. Gareth, can you hear us?
Hi there, guys. How you doing?
It's good. Where are you speaking to us from then?
I'm based out of Cape Town in South Africa, and it's in the home office. So if the time goes on, we may end up hearing the little one fighting about bedtime.
Oh, wow. Okay. So that's amazing. So we've got a truly intercontinental show today because we've got Jonathan in North America, I'm in Europe, you're in Africa. We're really almost spanning the whole globe here. It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, the wonder of the internet, huh?
Exactly. And speaking of the wonder of the internet, you're here to tell us about the serverless framework. So give us the kind of 10,000, 50,000, whatever, 100,000 foot view of serverless framework. What is serverless framework and what kind of problems am I looking to solve when I reach for it?
So the original idea from a quick look at the site is close, but not quite on the mark.
Okay.
The idea with the serverless framework is a sort of a different way of building web applications. And essentially, there is a way that you can reuse managed services available on cloud vendors like AWS and Google Cloud and Azure that allows you to build applications that doesn't actually require maintenance or running of any actual server. So you can get to the point where you run a full application with a front end and a back end, and there is nothing that you need to worry about CPU or RAM or load balancing or disaster recovery or any of that usual stuff that traditionally when you're building a highly scalable web application, you need to take care of and worry about. And the serverless framework comes in to help you spin those kinds of managed services up in a way that makes it easy to develop, easy to deploy, and manage at that point as well. And that's the very quick and dirty.
Excellent. And how did you come to be involved with it yourself?
Well, personally, I about almost 4 years ago now, I was in a situation where I was working for an organization that was trying to find a way to re-architect a monolithic application that wasn't quite meeting the needs of the company. And after some looking around and some advice from people I trusted, somebody mentioned, there's the serverless framework thing. It looks really good. You should probably take a look because it's making waves. And I ended up taking about 4 or 5 months at the time, sort of doing a deep investigation and finally figuring out that it was the perfect match for what I was looking to do.
Excellent. And we've got a joke question almost from the chat room. Eric Duckman's asking, is there any blockchain involved in this? We have a standard joke that we end up feeling a bit like Blockchain Weekly. Can we work blockchain in somehow?
You can if you choose to, but there's no blockchain.
There's no requirement for that. That's good to know. Yeah.
So, somebody blew my mind just the other day. I'll jump in real quick since Blockchain Weekly. You know what the killer app for blockchain is? It's Git.
Oh, wow.
You may continue.
I suppose. Has anyone done that yet? No worries. Thank you. Yeah.
Git uses basically blockchain underneath. And it blew my mind when I read this article. That's it. I'll stop and you guys can continue on with your regular scheduled show.
Yeah, no problem. Well, we'll pick that up on Blockchain Weekly after this, after we get through this. So yeah. So meanwhile, back at serverless anyway. So Gareth, what makes serverless better, and what kind of experience? So somebody who's never used it or never heard of it, what kind of things will stand out to them? Do you think? What's the experience that they're going to get from it?
Well, if we take sort of the traditional way that you build a web application, just sort of go back in history just a little bit to sort of set the context. I mean, when you're building a web application, you have to design traditionally a monolith on some kind of web framework. In the PHP world, it'll be something like a Symfony or a Django with Python, those kinds of things. You build this application on MVC, you then need to look at where you're going to host it. So if you're looking at a hosting within AWS, your solution is going to end up being something along the lines of a couple of EC2 instances with Apache or Nginx installed, probably a load balancer in front so that you can distribute traffic, auto scaling so that new instances can keep being generated. But at that point, you've had to spend time installing operating systems, installing software, managing those updates. If there's a vulnerability, it's up to you to then go in and install these updates to make sure that you're covered. If AWS decides to have an upgraded load balancer, now you have to go back in and swap out your old one for your new one without, disrupting service. Disaster recovery becomes an issue because now you need to make sure you've got backups. And if all your instances go down, if your virtual machines that run your app go down, what is your disaster recovery? What if the whole region goes down in AWS? So, depending on more how sort of enterprisey your solution becomes, these things become bigger and bigger problems that you need to deal with. And at the same token, if you're a lone developer who just wants to put something out there and get something running and working, well, there's a lot of stuff that you've got to spend time learning and getting to know. And before you've even coded anything to solve a particular problem for your organization or for your customers. So the idea with serverless is that instead of worrying about all of this infrastructure stuff that you need to get up to be able to run your application, the idea is to actually reduce the amount of code that you need to run it all. And the way this can be done is through using a lot of the managed services that already exist in something like AWS or Azure or Google Cloud even. And the idea is, you can think of something as simple as if you need to store a file somewhere, traditionally, you'd have to have a server that has got enough disk space that you have some way to scale in case uploads continue, or some way to transfer the data off onto external storage somehow. But if you plug in a service like S3, for example, that's an infinitely scalable storage service with massive amounts of throughput, and essentially you can throw traffic at it, and generally you'll never have a problem. If you look at other services like DynamoDB is a key value data store that's available with AWS as well. And these kinds of solutions, again, you don't have to worry about running a relational database if you use something like that. Instead of having to worry about when your CPU starts becoming too little for the task, if your queries are getting too high, your connection count is getting too high, you've now got to scale up your database, which is a mammoth task because you have that more than likely incurs downtime, and that is again worries that you need to things you need to worry about instead of building your application. And a managed service like DynamoDB can take over that because it has built-in SLA, built-in capacity just that's available on demand, and Amazon in the background manages all of that capacity for you. And there's a whole suite of these services, for example, and I'm talking about AWS primarily because that is kind of where the vast majority of serverless workloads end up going, just because of the maturity of AWS. And then and what I know as well, just personally, so it makes it easier to talk about. But the other services, you get things like simple notification service, SNS, which is a great way for pub/sub messaging, SQS for message queues, all of these things that traditionally you'd have to spin up your own software and manage the infrastructure for all of that, can be taken away with using managed services. And the final sort of linchpin in that whole spiel that I've just given you is AWS Lambda. So all of this stuff has been around for quite a long time now, but there's no way to tie these pieces together nice and cleanly with code. You need code at some point to work with all of these bits and pieces. So AWS Lambda was introduced or launched by Amazon in 2016, if I remember correctly, to general availability. And what this is a way for you to run code in a similar way that you can store files in S3. Instead of having to worry about a virtual machine or even a container with specific attributes and how to scale it, AWS Lambda is a service where you essentially say to them, here is a piece of code as a function. It can accept data from an event and process that data and do something to it. And then AWS will manage that scaling for you. So if you have 100 events all come in simultaneously, in the background, AWS is spinning up 100 copies of your Lambda function, executing your code in each Lambda function simultaneously and doing what it is that your code tells it to do. And you combine all these pieces together, and now you've got a very powerful way of building applications that takes away all that infrastructure worry, essentially, and lets you focus on building a solution instead.
Gareth, listening to this, I can't help but thinking of the term glue code, which tends to be fiendishly difficult to make universal. Is it fair to say that what serverless is doing is trying to write some universal glue code to make it easy to use all of these different services?
Well, yes, essentially, thankfully, because of the introduction of AWS Lambda, the service that AWS released, other cloud vendors came along like Azure and Google and released similar services that do a very similar thing, just in slightly different ways. And this is I think Amazon initially launched this as exactly what you're suggesting, just a way to have some kind of glue code that can help tie some services together. And it was only once they released it and the community around this got hold of Lambda and started using it for things I think they didn't intend, that they suddenly realized they had something far more powerful on their hands. Maybe I'm just naive. Maybe that's what they realized all along. But it's exactly that. You've got this idea of a bit of code sitting like glue between these services, passing data around as needed, transforming, doing what needs to be done, and helping you build applications, basically.
There's something magical about thousands of people using a service in ways that were never intended or anticipated.
Yeah, tell me about it. You get that from bug reports when you're building open source software as well.
Yes. Yeah. So does serverless, does it kind of replace having sysadmins and kind of an entire operations department?
To a degree, but it doesn't replace that role in larger organizations with a lot more work involved. I don't know how to describe it. If you think about smaller organizations who need to have a product out, you could think of small startups, 4 or 5 guys on a team trying to build something, and now they need to build something that's scalable and so on, and they need all of this DevOps knowledge in order to get it out there to handle the traffic that they're hoping and expecting to get. This is a way to solve that problem. Enterprises and bigger organizations are always going to have DevOps sysadmins on staff because there's always going to be some solution that can be probably solved better by having access to sort of base OS and even a lot of the times base metal with on-premise solutions. So it doesn't entirely get rid of that line of work, but it does help alleviate the lack of skills in that area which exists today.
So going back to the show's introduction, is serverless kind of a framework or an API that you would target when you're writing an application? Does it give you that ability to be agnostic as to which platform you're writing for? Yes,
to a degree. So I need to qualify it slightly. So if you decide that you want to build your application on AWS, you can do that. If you decide instead that you're going to build your application in the beginning on Azure, you can do that as well. And you can decide the same with Google Cloud. And there's actually a few other providers as well that aren't sort of your standard cloud providers like Spot Inst and so on. But the idea is that you can pick one of these vendors, and the starting experience is unique because unlike most sort of web dev frameworks that you've seen, you don't start with a highly opinionated collection of source code that sets up an entire project and that sets up all your file structure and things like that. The serverless framework runs with multiple runtimes, tries to support the runtimes that are available in Lambda and equivalent services. So you can write your serverless services in using JavaScript with Node or Python. There's for Java, .NET, and so on. So we can't provision a project structure for you based on that. So it needs to be very unopinionated. But what you get is an open source project in the background that when you on the command line decide that you want to deploy, so you type serverless deploy, it's going to read a single configuration file about how you've configured your entire service that you built, which elements in that cloud vendor that need to be created, and your code sitting in that Lambda function. That all then gets deployed to the cloud when you use the deploy command.
Is it possible to do crazy things like, say, run WordPress on top of serverless?
It is. It's a little tricky.
Would you do that?
It is a little tricky. I wouldn't.
Right.
But yeah, funny enough, PHP is a language that isn't natively supported on AWS Lambda. But there are communities out there, because the serverless framework has a very, very how can I put it, a very busy plugins community. And recently we've had a contributor who created an entire PHP serverless framework called Bref as well, that helps deploy PHP applications using the serverless framework onto AWS Lambda. And it's very native sort of PHP development experience using any PHP framework you like Symfony or any of these others that are out there.
Wow, that's
excellent.
impressive. So this particular plugin, you use that, and it basically you feel as though you're targeting a LAMP stack.
Yeah, very, very similar. What AWS did, which I think was pretty clever, is they had a lot of people complaining that their favorite runtime of choice wasn't natively supported with Lambda, myself included. But what they did, instead of trying to support all these different runtimes, is they said, we've created a new feature called Layers, which lets you create your own runtime, and you just include that layer into your Lambda function, and you can use it. Essentially, you're installing software onto the Lambda function's micro VM where it's executing. So you can have the PHP executable sitting in this when your code runs, for example, through a Lambda layer. Pretty cool technology.
Very cool.
Yeah, it sounds very cool indeed. It sounds fascinating. You've talked a lot about AWS, and I understand why you're saying it's more developed already. AWS itself, I should say, before I confuse people, is more kind of ready and developed for that. But I mean, you are kind of a bit agnostic about what kind of clouds you use. I mean, it's not just AWS. You can use IBM and Google and other things. So what's the support like on alternatives to AWS?
Well, in fact, right now, the Azure team, the Microsoft Azure team, have recently helped us update the sort of plugin for Azure as well. So that's pretty much ready. We even have some rather large customers who are looking to start deploying serverless projects onto Azure, which is pretty nice. Google Cloud, we also have a plugin there that has some functionality. Unfortunately, Google's implementation of cloud functions is kind of still, or at least, in the recent past, was kind of in flux. So the API behind that had been changing a bit over time, but it is operational. It's just not as feature-rich potentially as sort of the AWS and Azure offerings at the moment.
And I noticed you mentioned Kubernetes as well in some of your information there on the website. So what about if I'm a large organization or organization of any size that wants to use my own kind of private cloud or something? Would I be able to use serverless with that as well and integrate in some way with Kubernetes or something?
Yeah, we do have integration with some providers. A lot of these are often provided or built by those vendors and those providers of those platforms. So I have not had a chance to actually play with those a hell of a lot, unfortunately. But yes, the idea is that you can use the serverless framework to do a very similar thing. There's a project called OpenFaaS, for example, which allows you to create functions as a service, which is kind of the bucket that Lambda falls into, but on your own private infrastructure, for example. And you can use a serverless framework to manage and deploy your applications into your own private functions as a service type of environment as well.
Excellent. Yeah, I can just see that being something that some enterprise customers would want. Some organizations like to keep things in house, but I suppose to some degree as well, you're kind of not mitigating, but maybe reducing the advantage of having your stuff, of using serverless and having this elasticity to kind of react to things if you're relying as well on your own infrastructure. If you've got it in AWS or any of the alternatives, you can kind of handle, I would assume, pretty much anything. So I suppose there's a bit of that to it as well, as putting it in your own little silo might be limiting the possibilities of what you can do.
Well, that's exactly what we think as well. Serverless as an architecture and a concept is really more powerful when you've got all of these available services to you that kind of take away the need for you to write your own code to do those kinds of functions. I like to think of it as code. The more code you write, the more problems you create, or potential problems you create. So to have these sort of unified services that are shared among so many people, and being up to a company like AWS to manage that infrastructure and those services, is, to me, just seems like a more reliable way of running your applications. Not to mention the fact that we actually see a lot of customers these days who have on-premise solutions start looking at making the move into cloud because they're seeing these data center problems of scalability and so on themselves, and then come across the serverless framework and realize that there's a way for them to come into this without having to go into that massive investment of learning about all of these infrastructure things that they now need to get used to. Whereas a serverless framework lets you kind of try things out, spin things up and spin things down, and a lot of the time at almost zero cost. So.
And it looks like it's been. I was looking at like some of the adoption. You've got like companies like Coca-Cola on there and others who've taken it up. So who's using this right now, and what's the kind of coolest things you've seen people doing with it?
Well, one of the coolest ones, if anybody's a gamer out there, they might have heard about the EA Play conference that happened, I think it was a month or two ago. Mm-hmm. And EA essentially created a mobile application. If you were an attendee or even someone sitting at home who just wanted to see the events happening at the gaming con, you could use the application to do that. And on the floor, you'd use that to sort of scout the venue, to schedule where you wanted to go next and so on. And that entire application to serve all 20,000 attendees on that whole weekend was built through serverless. That was that to me was a very cool use of that. And there's a fair number of other customers that are doing a lot of volume. I'm just not sure how much I can actually just talk about them specifically. But there's a lot of exciting stuff that's happening in serverless. It's quite yeah.
Yeah, of course. I understand that you can't give specifics, certainly to do with clients and so on. That makes sense. But it sounds like it's definitely kind of taken off. And I was interested in the community side of things. I mean, obviously, this is an open source project. You're on GitHub. Well, let's be honest, you wouldn't be on here. It wouldn't be on this show specifically. You might be on a different one, but you wouldn't be on this show specifically if it wasn't an open source project. But it's under the MIT license and stuff. And I was having a look. So, what's the kind of interaction with the community like? Do you get do you accept pull requests? Do you get pull requests? Do you you have plugins you mentioned? How does that kind of work out?
Well, pretty much everything we do is on GitHub. There's only a very few limited pieces that isn't available for the community to look at and contribute to. Everything from the framework itself, obviously, everything from our blog, our website, even a lot of the plugins that we bundle, with the core framework. All of that is sitting open source on GitHub. And it's quite interesting sometimes when I have somebody contact me and say, "Oh, I've noticed a typo on your website here." I just say to them, "Thanks so much. If you want the GitHub credit for fixing that, then feel free to make a pull request." And in a couple of hours, somebody's fixed the bug for me. So, but without the community, to be more serious about it, without the community, the serverless framework wouldn't be where it is now. We were just talking earlier today about a release that's coming up where I think something like 2 out of the 4 main features that we're deploying was actually originally initiated by pull requests from community members and just tweaked by some of the core team. And we have that a lot. We have bug fixes often come in out of the blue. Somebody's picked up a bug that we don't even know about sometimes, and they've already pushed a fix for it, to full-on requests. And the community has been fantastic. We couldn't be there without them.
So I'm curious, particularly when the community has feature requests. How does that work? Is that something you guys just take care of, or is there a price tag for we can? Some projects, this is the way they make money. We can certainly make that feature work for you, but here's the cost of it. How does that work for you guys?
Well, we actually have the ability for anybody in the community to make a feature request through GitHub, just through the issues tracker in GitHub. And in general, this tends to go along the route of somebody in the core team decides this is a really good idea, or even our CEO, Austin Collins, he might say, oh, that's a great idea. Let's include that into discussion for the next meeting. And during that time, it might even get fleshed out some more by more of the community members. There's more discussion goes on. And eventually it gets to the point where we decide, all right, well, this has got enough traction and this seems like a good time. Let's implement this feature that everybody's been asking for. There's nothing in the way of asking for a price tag on any of this kind of thing. The serverless framework is completely open source when it comes to the feature set that we provide. There's nothing hidden.
Okay, so it's not an open core funding model.
No, not at all.
What is the business model then? How do you guys make money and pay the bills?
All right, so we have a bit of a sort of Red Hat style of funding at the moment, where we offer enterprise customers building large-scale serverless applications the ability to make use of the team for support. And this is in the lines of everything from an SLA-based sort of support where you can expect a response from the team, like in development, or you have a production application that has an issue and you want somebody to take a look at it, to architectural reviews, because the whole serverless space is kind of new, so people aren't sure exactly what the best practices look like yet. Even workshops, almost anything that will provide the support that a customer needs. But we also have a tool at the moment. So I'm going to sort of backtrack a little bit, because serverless sounds fantastic when you hear about it as a developer. And when you're building your first application and you get that dopamine hit of just a bit of configuration, type the deploy command, and suddenly you've got a production-ready API endpoint hitting some code that's writing stuff to a database table. It sounds fantastic. But traditionally, a lot of the problems with serverless development has been in line of monitoring, because you're using a little bit of this service and a little bit of this service and a bit of code over here, but you don't quite understand what's happening here and happening here and happening with your code, and what these requests look like, how many requests you're getting, what the errors look like. So one of the tools we built is what we call Serverless Framework Enterprise. And it's really a sort of a SaaS application that's integrated to some degree with the serverless framework. So when you're busy doing your deployments, using the framework to build your application, you have the option to sign up to the service, to the tool. And what it provides is some features that don't really make sense unless you have some way to store data behind the scenes. And what I mean by that is storing logging information, which ordinarily, it takes a long time to set up, costs a bit of money, and you can't really, it's very difficult to integrate purely through an open source solution. So we have a solution that does that kind of thing for you. You connect to your account on Serverless Framework Enterprise, you deploy your service, and there's no instrumentation. You don't have to change anything in your code or anything else. And it automatically starts helping track, how many times your Lambda function has been called, and what errors might be happening, and let you investigate these kinds of things. What we've tried to do as well is we realize that we're an open source company, so and this is kind of an important tool. So what we try to do as well is find a way for everybody using the serverless framework to have some use out of it. So we actually have a free tier on there as well, where a lot of the features are free forever, always kind of scenario. But the one portion, the logging portion, we have the free tier allows logging of up to 1 million Lambda invocations per month as well. And that's the two sides of essentially where serverless is funded, basically.
Is this what the website refers to as the serverless dashboard?
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
Okay, excellent. That sounds like a pretty neat tool. When you were talking with Dan just a minute ago, he asked you about some of the larger applications and such. I always like to ask guests, what is the weirdest thing you've seen someone do with your project?
So for me, what I have seen is somebody was able to take a PHP binary. I'm going to go back to PHP because that's part of my history as well. I used to be a full-time PHP web developer. But somebody took a PHP binary and was able to get this executing in Lambda functions, and then used a tool called Codeception, which allows you to execute integration tests against a URL using Chrome headless. So essentially, you're simulating a web browser in a Lambda function and clicking on links on a web page and filling in forms on a site. And they use this to load test their actual site, so they could spin up. I think they were telling me it was something like 10,000 Lambda functions in parallel and 10 parallel executions of Codeception. So they were essentially load testing 50,000 simulated users on their site to try and do some load testing. So that was a pretty interesting usage of the framework. Yeah,
that's actually really clever. It's because load testing is one of those sometimes difficult problems to solve. What about, since we're talking about testing, what about like code testing for serverless? How robust and, as far as security goes, how well tested is all of this code?
Well, the framework itself has a full suite of unit tests at the moment. I'm not sure it's 100% coverage yet, but it is very close to that. We also have, because of the nature of working with a bunch of AWS managed services and so on and other providers, we also have a suite of integration tests that we normally run as well, just to make sure that when we have sort of test deployments that we deploy into the cloud vendors and then run our integration tests to see that the framework has deployed things correctly, that things execute correctly, and so on. So we really work very hard to have the sort of pre-testing of the framework before it goes live and people use it in production. But like any software tool out there will be instances where you can't be perfect and bugs will creep through. But yeah, it's a case of just continuously adding those tests to try and cover those points that we don't see.
Yeah. You mentioned Microsoft Azure, and I think you said that some of the actual Microsoft guys help you get something working. Do you mean to tell us that Microsoft actually contributed something to an open source project? And yes, there's a sarcasm tag here, but...
Yeah, Microsoft has been contributing to open source lately. I never thought I'd see the day personally, but it's welcome news when you've got a company of that size and that amount of clout essentially in the industry. It's fantastic news to see them doing work like they're doing. We don't want to turn this into Microsoft Open Source Weekly, but there's a ton of there's tools that they've developed that I use on a daily basis, and happily. Even though I've had my skepticism from the past.
Sure. And then, fittingly, that we're talking about Microsoft to lead into this. What have you guys done to avoid vendor lock-in? So we've touched on this a little bit, but what are the ways that you help people avoid getting locked into one of these providers? It's not likely that Amazon's going to go under anytime soon, but if something happens and someone needs to move off of Amazon, what tools are available?
Well, one of the things we'd advise anybody who asks us that same question is, so just to go back to sort of a bit of the nuts and bolts about how the framework works and just put the context in place. When you're developing a serverless application, you're essentially setting up a lot of configuration of what your service in the cloud is going to look like. And this is in a YAML file usually, but there is support for JSON or even JavaScript objects if you prefer, setting up configuration that way. But when you deploy your service, it's this configuration file will say that it's for AWS or it's for Azure or it is for Google Cloud. And if you get to the point, if you're concerned about, the day comes when maybe the company's bought and the new owners don't like AWS anymore and only want to go into Azure, which happens from time to time. If what you tend to want to do is when you're building your solution, what the functions side, so that if you're building for AWS Lambda, just to make it a clear example, what you have is a function that we call a handler. And this function will receive an event object. So to make it a more concrete example, AWS has a service called API Gateway, and Azure has an example as a service called Endpoints, if I remember correctly, the naming scheme. And they both do essentially the same thing. They allow you to spin up a API endpoints that are it's fully SLA. They run the capacity. There's an enormous amount of capacity available. You just drive traffic to your endpoint, and that endpoint is then connected to your code in a Lambda function or as an Azure function. And these functions, as I was saying, have a handler that receives the data from this event. So if an HTTP request is made to your endpoint, that request data is then sent to the function in a very specific format, specific to that vendor. And this handler what you normally want to do is use the handler to break the data out of that sort of proprietary format, which is usually just a JSON object of some type, and then have your business logic abstracted out of that. So you can just pass the data that you pulled out of the handler to your business logic externally. And if you switch vendors, if you switch from AWS to Azure, all you need to do is edit the handler. So all you're doing is taking out the data, extracting the data out of the post data from your post request and sending it to the business logic, and everything else continues to work exactly the same way. So it's partly a configuration file that needs to be changed, and then partly one small piece of code if you've structured things correctly sort of from the beginning. And it's not a terribly difficult thing to do if you've had that foresight. Otherwise, it ends up being a case where you need to rewrite some of your Lambda functions and just change your configuration. On the other side, to add to that, we do have customers who will want code deployments. So they'll have essentially the same feature set go to one cloud vendor and to another cloud vendor. And what we have is we have a feature that you can make use of that allows you to have two separate configuration files that sit side by side in your project. So when you deploy, you can run a deployment on your AWS configuration file, for example, and then another deployment on your Azure configuration file. And each deployment runs independently with whichever handlers and whichever configuration you need to sort of simulate your solution. And again, if you've abstracted out your business logic at that point, both handlers on both sides are using the same business logic. So you then have a cross-vendor application at that point.
Is there? That's an interesting thought. We're all familiar with every once in a while something at Amazon or something at Google breaks and half of the internet goes dark. Does Serverless have a failover between the different cloud vendors? Because it sounds like that 90% of what that would require you just described as being in place.
Well, the reason that some organizations go with the sort of dual vendor route is for exactly that. So that if an S3 breakage happens, like happened a few years back, they can just switch DNS to point at their Azure endpoints. And that just means that you've built it from the get-go to deploy exactly the same feature set between the two services. And the very nice thing about building services in this way is that you can have a lot of stuff running in the background that a user never sees, but you're developing yourself as a developer. So you could have, if your primary vendor is Azure, for example, and your fallback is Amazon, if your data store is sitting on Azure infrastructure, when you're populating data into this Azure data store, you can have Azure functions in the background listening for events on that data store, and then sending that data, by HTTP or whatever method you decide on to the sort of AWS backend to replicate that over that side. So if this disaster recovery situation happened, you might be a couple of seconds behind on the data, but at least you can still have a service up and running that's relatively in sync with what the data should look like.
That's very impressive. I think there are some large companies that need to get on that. It wasn't very long ago. It was just about a week ago that a bunch of things across the internet broke for a little while because I don't remember if it was Google or Amazon that did something. You've mentioned running the deploy command, and I'm curious, where does one actually run the deploy command? Is there part of the serverless code that runs on the local desktop, or if not, then what server does the serverless code run on in that case?
Well, pretty much all serverless development happens on a local machine, and it's as simple as, well, the serverless framework at a base level is an npm module. So if you have npm installed on your machine, you can start using the serverless framework just with an npm install -g serverless, and that installs the serverless framework onto your machine to be accessible in the command line with just using the serverless command. And recently, we had, a couple of weeks ago, we had a release which allowed us to have an onboarding, to onboard users a bit more cleanly, where you can essentially on the command line, you type serverless and you get stepped through a list of questions, which helps you set up your new service that you want to build. Everything from asking you what the name is of your new service to which provider you want to deploy to, which runtime you plan on using, and even if you want to connect to the serverless framework dashboard that I was talking about before for monitoring and so on, to help you set all of that sort of stuff up. And the CLI tool is where a lot of the work happens when you're ready with your code and your configuration to start sending things into the provider that you've chosen. And it literally becomes as simple as setting up a configuration file, sometimes as little as 5 or 6 lines, and using serverless deploy, and you end up with, like I mentioned, a production-ready API endpoint that could receive 10,000 requests a second, that has complete failover and disaster recovery, that can point at code that can be replicated that can run 1,000 times in parallel. And all with just 4 or 5 lines of configuration and a couple of CLI commands.
That sounds it all sounds really, really kind of smooth and easy to do, which is great. But Jonathan hit on something there that I should have mentioned probably way at the start of the show, or asked about even. The name serverless is interesting. Do people ever get confused by that? Because obviously there need to be servers involved.
Yeah, there's of course there's servers involved. The idea of the name, and we didn't actually, the company didn't coin it. It's a name, and I can't remember who originated it, but somebody came up with the idea of calling this sort of style of development serverless, because it's meant to describe sort of the developer point of view. If you're building applications in this way, you're not actually seeing any servers. You're seeing a service that you make use of, and somewhere behind that, there's going to be some machine somewhere with a CPU and RAM that's actually doing things. But as far as you're concerned as a developer, you don't ever have to worry about what's actually happening in the background with that machine. And it's very liberating. It just lets you focus on producing results for your organization and your customers instead of worrying about infrastructure and all of the other things I mentioned before.
Yeah, that is very true. And as Jonathan's just pointed out to me in the back chat there, the cloud is just someone else's server. That is very true. Lots of people don't realize that. Amazing how many people don't realize that. Yeah. So what kind of stuff are you working on at the moment? Have you got a roadmap for things that you want to kind of bring in, or where do you think you're heading with the serverless framework?
Well, there's always a lot to do. There's so many different sort of event sources and things through all these different services. AWS, for example, recently released a feature called Event Bridge, which we pushed a release out on Monday, I believe it was. So yeah, there's an enormous amount of directions to go to. There's many more providers we want to make sure we support. So the serverless dashboard mentioned before currently only supports AWS and the Node runtime. So that's also a product that we're very busy working on to make sure that we can provide these kind of tools to the community. And just on a more community basis, we're spending a lot of time and effort in trying to help people looking to build applications sort of serverlessly, because it's a very new way of building things, and there tends to be some confusion as to how to start putting all these pieces together to build, for example, just a basic web application with a front end and a back end. And this is in documentation, in video content that we're actually busy producing, blog posts and so on. We're constantly busy building all of these things. As far as the actual roadmap for the serverless framework open source, we do have kind of a roadmap ahead. In fact, today we were talking internally about some of the things that we're planning on releasing soon. So very, how can I put it, very fine-grained detail, sort of, things like supporting existing S3 buckets instead of trying to create one from scratch. and a lot of this is actually visible on our GitHub as well. So if anybody goes to look at the issues, they should be able to see which features are in progress and are included in a specific release that'll be upcoming. So the roadmap should be available there too.
Excellent. And it sounds like there's lots of interesting things coming. And you mentioned that, you've got the sort of the community side of things as well, people contributing stuff. If people want to get involved with serverless, if they want to get involved with the open source project, how would they do that? And what kind of things are you looking for? Are you looking for anything specific?
Anything. Well, a lot of the projects you have on the show tend to say that anything is useful, and it's true in this case as well. We have the need for anybody who wants to add more documentation. We have the plugins ecosystem that I mentioned briefly before, and we have a huge collection of these plugins that the community have built that help solve sort of very niche problems, but actual problems that people need solutions for as well. That doesn't entirely make sense a lot of the time to fill into the core framework, but totally makes sense if you're somebody with that problem. These are just contributed by the community as well. And as part of that, I mustn't forget to mention, we've actually recently launched what we call our plugin support program. So what happens a lot of the time is when you're building a serverless application, you start mixing in a few of these plugins from the community, which is great, except if you're a enterprise customer who needs some assurance about the quality of code and the maintenance of this code going forward. You don't necessarily want to be burdened with having to look after somebody else's pet project, a year down the line when they've, given up on it. So what we've done is we've introduced the plugin support program, which allows plugin authors to bring their plugins up to a certain level of quality as far as documentation and allowing and responding to requests from the serverless framework team for improvements or bug fixes. And we give them a certain status as a certified or approved plugin on our side. And also it gives us the ability then, because the documentation's improved, there's testing in place, allows us the opportunity as the core team to go in and potentially enhance and fix any problems down the line with a plugin that someone may be having. And it gives assurance on both sides. So the plugin authors have some status in the community that they have a certified plugin. They have a badge that they can display on their GitHub page. And the customers who make use of these plugins on a regular basis are now just assured of the fact that, whatever happens, this code is being looked after and won't be abandoned, or any issues that come up, a support contract will essentially allow us to go in and fix a problem, with the SLA involved. So it's kind of a win-win on all sides for us, and we quite excited about releasing that with our community.
Yeah, that sounds excellent. And we're starting to kind of run up towards the end of the time that we've got, unfortunately, Gareth. But is there anything that that we haven't asked you, or you'd like to say about serverless, about the serverless framework that maybe we missed or we didn't get to?
Well, I guess the only thing I would suggest is that if anybody is listening and finds it kind of compelling and interesting, if you're looking for a little bit more content that might provide some more context and some demo as to how this looks, we have a YouTube channel where we're starting to release more and more content. So feel free to look up the Serverless YouTube channel and just go to serverless.com, install the tool, run the serverless command, just try things out. And to add to that, the one of the really nice benefits about building serverless applications is that 99% of the time, if you're just trying something out and deploying, something into a cloud vendor, they have a lot of free tiers available in a lot of these services, including pretty much everything I've spoken about tonight, that will cost you nothing just to play with. You could deploy API endpoints and Lambda functions and all of these features and never incur any kind of bill, which makes it really great for just playing out, trying out some of these features. And then using the serverless framework again, you can just use the serverless remove command, and it completely removes all that infrastructure from your vendor's account, so you never have to worry about it. But it's a great tool to just try something, push it out, give it a try, and then remove it when you're done, or continue to build with it as you see fit.
Excellent. So if people want to find out more, they should head to serverless.com, which is the place to start. And before we let you go, Gareth, I have to ask you, I mean, I know you listen to the show, so you'll be very familiar with this. Yeah. I have to ask you Randall's 2 favorite questions in his absence. So first up, I've got to ask, what is your favorite scripting language?
Randall's going to hate me. JavaScript.
JavaScript? Wow.
Yeah.
I wonder.
I've got to admit that wasn't what I was expecting. All right, and so that's not. We'll. It's okay. Randall's not here, so you're safe. And then what about favorite text editor then, or coding environment?
I'm 2 for 2 for the Randall hate. It's going to be Vim.
Excellent. Excellent. That is really good. It takes all sorts, and it's going back to the whole. I'm not here to promote Microsoft in any way, but going back, of course, but going back to the whole Microsoft open source contributions. I know Randall's very into VS Code at the moment, and lots of people seem to like that. I think it's even written in JavaScript, so I don't know. Maybe that's one to check out. I'll have to have a look at it. But yeah, that's great. So thanks very much for coming on and talking to us, Gareth. It's been great. I'm sure we'll catch up again somewhere down the line when much more developments and stuff to tell us about.
Awesome. It was great being on the show. Thanks a lot, guys.
All right there. So that was Gareth McCumskey from Serverless Framework, or Serverless Inc., who make the Serverless Framework. And it sounds really, really interesting. So what did you think about it then, Jonathan?
I think that's really interesting. The ability to do Amazon Lambda kind of seems to be the central enabler of all of this. But it's cool. It's really cool that they've got this framework to let you just. It's a lot of, it really is. It's a lot of glue code that they've managed to make universal, which is impressive. I don't know. It sounds like one of those projects that I will indeed have to go play with after the show. It sounds really neat.
Well, that's what we like to hear. You know, that's what Randall always says. The projects you're going to want to go and download and play with after the show. Yeah, it sounds really interesting. I feel increasingly like a dinosaur these days when it comes to these things, because you know I know this stuff's really, really popular. I need to try and catch up, I suppose, with some of these new trends in development and so on. Yeah, I suppose I'm just too old school at times. So get off my lawn. And but no, it sounds fantastic. And if you're interested, go and check out Serverless. Go to Serverless.com. Really popular right now. I know a lot of people will be tuning in to check out the show because it is like something that's really hot right now. It's taking off, so that's very, very cool. Yeah, all right. And so there's some stuff I should mention now. Actually, we've got some upcoming guests, and one of them, we've got Hacker Day next week, which is something to do with some guy called Jonathan Bennett. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, back a few months ago, I sent an email and said, "Hey, I know how to write. Can I write?" And I don't know what they were thinking, but the guys at Hackaday said, "Sure, we'll let you give it a try." So, yeah, I'm one of the writers over at Hackaday, and then we were looking for guests. Hackaday.com, by the way, is a blog covering all things tech, some open source, but mainly it's just the weird and crazy hacks that people come up with. And so, you know, there's a lot that fall under that heading. But a lot of it is open source software, open source hardware. And so when we were kind of scrambling for a guest for next week, I emailed Randall and I said, well, what if we do something with Hackaday? I can probably get one of the editors to come on. And so we do. We've got, I believe Mike is going to be on and going to be talking about probably the history of Hackaday and also just, their coverage of open source and how all of that has come about. I'm looking forward to it. I think it'll be fun.
Yeah, it should be really fun. And it's rare that I can kind of, because often when I read this list of guests that we've got coming up, I don't know much about what's going on. So it's fantastic to be able to kind of ask one of the guests almost what it's all about. And you're going to be switching between kind of guest and co-host mode, I believe.
I'll be doing a little bit of double duty, probably mostly co-host because, obviously I've not been with Hackaday for the longest time. But yeah, I kind of count as a sort of guest, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. That sounds excellent. So so doing double time there, double duty. That's excellent. So that's coming up on August the 7th next week. And fingers crossed, Randall will have internet again and he'll be back. Jonathan will definitely be back for that. And then the following week, we've got Pearl Dancer. Pearldancer.org is the guest project. Jason Chrome and Sawyer X, I believe, are going to be telling us about that. So that's on the 14th, August the 14th. And then we've got a couple of open slots that we could probably, I'm sure will be filled very shortly. And speaking of that, actually, if you're watching this, listening to this, and you think, I know of a great open source project that should be on Floss Weekly, and it hasn't been yet, then that's great. We're always looking for new projects to talk about, and you've probably got great ideas out there. It's the open spirit of open source to go out and speak to the community and find out what you guys want to hear about. So if you think of one of those projects, one of those projects, maybe you work in one of those projects, contact them, contact the head developer if you can, or somebody there, and have them contact Randall is the best way to do it. So Randall's email address is merlin@stonehenge.com. It's all on the website at twit.tv under Floss if you want to check that. There's contact stuff there. Have someone from the project contact Randall, and then we can get them to the top of the list and get them scheduled in, and then you'll hear them on a future Floss Weekly. That's how this kind of works. That's behind the curtain. That's how this works. So please do that. Don't forget, you can follow us on Twitter if you like. We're at Floss Weekly on Twitter. And Randall was very attached to Google Plus, and he used to use that a lot. But I believe he's working on an alternative now, since Google have kind of given up on that now. So we're working on an alternative so that the different hosts can post things through as well. But you can find us at Floss Weekly on Twitter. Of course, you can watch the show taping live. You can do that on twit.tv on the website there. It's at 9:30 in the morning, Leo time, or California time. So you can do that. Go and check that out as well. And you can chat along. People have been doing that. We had a bit of input from the chat room. There's a live IRC chat room going on as we do this, so people have been chipping in there, and you can find that via the website as well. I think it's irc.twit.tv, but more of the information is on the website as well. So please come and jump in there and ask your questions, and we can put them to the guests. All right, and so I want to mention very quickly before we go, I'm going to do my regular plugs, if you like. I'm still plugging OggCamp, which is an event that I, along with Simon actually of this parish, Simon Phipps of this parish, I helped to organise. And that's in the UK. It's an open source conference. It's happening in Manchester in the UK in the north, and it's the 19th and 20th of October this year. So it's just under 3 months, about 10 weeks away, something like that right now. It's our 10th anniversary. It's our 10th birthday this year. We're going to have a big party. We're going to have it's a bar camp. It's an open source, free software, free culture bar camp. So all things open basically. Although not that name obviously, because somebody's got that. And you can come along and get involved at oggcamp.org. That's oggcamp.org is the place to go, and you can get your tickets now. You can get them for free. You can give us a donation if you want. Completely up to you. You can find out what's going on via the website. We've got some speakers listed on there. You should come along and give a talk and get involved and do all that kind of stuff. And obviously. If you want to get involved with OggCamp in any way, then just come on and drop me a line. You can find me via my via Twitter at MethodDan, or on my website danlynch.org. And that feels like a lot of plug-in now. So Jonathan, is there anything you want to plug? Because I feel like I've hogged the plug-in time there.
Yeah, sure. So you can follow me on Twitter at JP_Bennett, and you can also watch Hackaday from my weekly security column that goes every Friday. And then if you see something on Twitter or in the news, security related, that you want me to cover, you think I should see, or you want a better explanation of, feel free to tag me on Twitter and I'll take a look at it. And we'll see what we can do to explain it on Fridays.
Brilliant. Well, that sounds fantastic. And thank you very much for coming on and co-hosting, Jonathan. It's great to be back together again. Hopefully it won't be won't be as long next time.
Yes, I always enjoy it, Dan.
Okay, that's great. So, and with that, I think the music's coming up behind me, and we're at the end of the show. So that's it for this episode of Floss Weekly. Join us next time for another episode of Floss Weekly.